think we need a non-classical picture in international relations to understand the jazzy situation of the present moment. That's the nature of a negotiation. In a sense, reality itself, on the picture that I'm proposing, reality itself is diplomatic. We need to become Europeans in light of Donald Trump's imperative, right? On all sorts of levels, obviously, including the military. Now, the question, I think, maybe the even more interesting question is, who can we become in the conversation with China? And we are much less ready to answer that question. And I think this is also an opportunity for us, right, to revise our own worldview and to go back to resources that we also had before, right? Non-modernity, pre-modernity, right, and the indigenous is as much part of Europe as it is of any other place. So we need to look at those dimensions of the various European traditions, which will also then become a platform for conversations with China.
Welcome to Cosmolab, a series of conversations on the complexity of our relations with China. The series is organized by the China Knowledge Network. Today, in our opening conversation, we meet with Markus Gabriel, a philosopher from Germany who is explaining the value of new realism to ground our relationships. Professor Markus Gabriel holds the chair in Epistemology at Bonn University. He's a prolific writer and has a wide audience. His work on new realism has great influence in contemporary philosophy. Where does this new realism come from and what's wrong with the old?
So, historically speaking, one can argue that new realism as a philosophical family of movements or as a philosophical movement starts in the 21st century precisely in light of various crises that now add up to the system of complexity. So it's certainly not a coincidence that the new realism movement takes up speed after the financial crisis. To a certain extent, it's always been a reaction to 9/11 and the philosophical and intellectual movements that led to it or that accompanied these two big moments in the 21st century. So let me briefly elaborate. So new realism and the other members of the family react specifically to a constellation that we now see, in politics, namely postmodernism. Postmodernism now is simply my name for the idea that, reality and fiction, truth and lie, the genuine and the copy, the original and so forth, right? These fundamental concepts, or knowledge and fake news, are becoming indistinguishable due precisely to the modern constitution of knowledge. So if we just think of the most recent, episode in this drama, namely AI, artificial intelligence, then we can easily see how deep fakes or the threat to, the political realm, from liberal democracy to other forms of governance, is already a side effect of artificial intelligence. And what is AI if not precisely a model of intelligence that is indistinguishable from the original? So once we have all these potential confusions between the real and the non-real, new realism comes in and develops tools to distinguish in the symbolic realm, in the fictional, in the media, in the political, in the social, right, in science. New realism tries to distinguish what is real from what is illusory. And that requires, and this is where new realism is new, the elaboration of a theory of illusions. Old realism just told us reality is that which doesn't go away if we don't look at it. Reality is what corrects our beliefs, right? What is there anyhow, independently of human affairs. New realism now looks at the human affairs and includes them in our picture of reality. So new realism integrates the human being with all our activities, including, the symbolic activities of media production, ideologies, propaganda, and manipulation, and includes all of this in a more coherent and full-blown picture of reality. That's the innovation in the movement.
You plead for moral facts, for moral progress. You even called for a metaphysical pandemic. We need a metaphysical pandemic, I remember, during the COVID days. It's actually protecting the reality of what we know. So how there is not just a formal knowledge approach, there's also human consciousness involved. So I mean,
yeah, so like one important thing about neorealism, one of its starting points is the rejection of physicalism and even of naturalism in general, which is the modern worldview in particular in the West, but not exclusively. So here's the thought that is associated with old realism and leads from an old conception of realism to physicalism and naturalism. So here's how the story unfolds historically. So it's very natural to think of reality as that which is the case independently of our activities. So what's really real, nature, is that which we objectively characterize by way of mathematical models, empirical investigation, studies and such. And compared to this type of objectivity, which the philosopher Thomas Nagel has, characterized as the view from nowhere, a take on reality that abstracts from our presence, right? Compared to that, we need to give an account of how we fit into this picture. And this brings in the issue of consciousness. So typically many neuroscientists and physicists and other scientists will tell us that consciousness is still a mystery. So even the most hard-nosed scientists will admit that we don't really know right now what our subjective point of view is. So how come that some parts of the universe, right, molecules that form cells and that add up to human animals and other animals, how come that these parts of reality are conscious of reality? And what is consciousness? We don't even know what exactly consciousness is correlated with. We do know that there must be some correlation between consciousness and a human animal, particularly something with a brain, but we don't know what exactly it is about the brain that makes parts of it the relevant correlate of consciousness. So these are scientific unknowns. And neorealism will now argue that, the mistake is to think that reality, right, is what physics describes, such that the other forms of knowledge, the humanities or just everyday knowledge, what philosophers call the manifest image of the world, that is the reality as we experience it, that this is somehow an illusion. Neorealism turns this around and argues that, while of course reality is in part exactly the way that physics describes it, but physics describes only a part of reality, namely whatever physics can describe, and that's in particular matter and energy, so more or less fermions and bosons in fields, right? That's kind of what physics is capable of characterizing. But as a matter of fact, we can't even produce a full physical model of a human animal, given that human animals are driven, for instance, by desires, intentions, feelings, and consciousness.
that would also perhaps entail that there is a relationship between new realism coming up and what is happening in the sciences itself or themselves, like complexity science coming up, where actually complexity scientists look at the whole matrix of all the sciences and try to be intellectually modest per corner in the matrix or per position in the matrix, and to arrive at some thinner description per discipline, and pay more attention to the linkages between the disciplines. Such as, for example, I remember David Krakauer from the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity, who espouses a whole theory on the necessity to not focus on the fundamentals in physics, but to include fundamental theories with effective theories. And they might be hiding in the cracks between biology and research after the DNA, or in between sociology and political science, with an equal value for this effective theory. Is that correct, that assumption?
So contemporary science indeed, in general, embraces the idea of irreducibly complex systems and thus also of emergence. So the idea of emergence means that, if you have a bunch of elements, however many elements, then the system that the elements form together, their joint behavior, can be best described only if we take the whole system into account. Just think of, a very simple example would be swarm intelligence, right? So you see a group of animals, birds, right? It's very prominent in birds, but you don't need birds, right? A human animal does it by itself. So you look at a bunch of, living elements, cells or whole animals. And now the question is, how best to characterize the behavior of the system. And the complexity theorists will say that, once the elements are in a particular type of dynamic order, then what they do over time is best explained if we look at the whole and not at its parts. And we even know that this is the case in fundamental physics, where we have the phenomenon of entanglement. In the case of entangled systems, two elementary particles or more elementary particles are such that we can look at the behavior of the whole system, but we can never know the exact contribution of the parts to the behavior of the whole system. And that is even true in fundamental quantum mechanics. And it generalizes, right, to more complicated systems, where complicated just means more elements, such that we get the phenomenon of emergence, meaning new levels of reality emerge out of simpler elements. And that is the case basically across all the sciences today.
Would you say that not only new realism is a reflection of a sort of reorientation of realism in a fundamental sense? It's relevant for the fundamental sciences, but it's also relevant for the applied sciences. And economics is another case in point, where we shift from very simple models, DGSE models with two actors, where firms maximize their profits and households minimize their costs, and we think that is a valid depiction of reality. Whereas someone like David Krakow would say, no, that is just one dimension. It is much too small. It doesn't give us the information we need to understand this systemic nature that you talk about, and the adaptation processes that are much more complex.
Yes, so new realism, in my own approach to it, is based on what I call the ontology of fields of sense. So the basic unit of reality is not the object or the particle, if we speak, the language of the natural sciences. The basic system is a field. Now, fields are spaces, arrangements of objects such that every point in the field has a so-called value. And the value of a point in a field is what I call a sense. And that's the revolution, that's the new contribution by new realism. Here, a sense is a way for reality to appear. So old realism thinks that reality might be on the other side of an unbridgeable gap between mind and reality. How could we possibly know anything about reality, right, beyond our skulls? That's the spirit of old realism, right? How do I know that reality is, in any way like its representation in me, in my brain, in my mind? New realism says that here's how I know. Reality itself radiates information. Reality makes itself known to us. But the way, and that's its sense, but the way in which reality makes itself known to us is essentially constitutively complex. That is why reality is always more complex than even the most complex and best scientific model of it. Reality is fundamentally unpredictable. But that does not mean precisely that we are in a hopeless position. On the contrary, right? Fundamentally, humans negotiate their way through reality. So human social relations, that's also a new contribution from new realism, human social relations constitute full-blown objectivity. So the fact that humans cooperate, right, under competitive conditions, I call this co-petition. So the fact that we're in competitive situations discloses reality to us in field-like structures. So we need to start to think also in international relations, like in physics and other sciences, in terms of fields that are occupied by unpredictable points. And once we change our paradigm from a kind of Newtonian simple paradigm of points move through space, pushed along by forces, right? That would be the classical picture. I think we need a non-classical picture in international relations to understand the jazzy situation of the present moment. That's the nature of a negotiation. In a sense, reality itself, on the picture that I'm proposing, reality itself is diplomatic.
Could we speak of reality as diplomatic? And does that entail we need epistemological diplomacy? We need to engage, talking about how we can know reality? Because suppose we have a flock of humans that are strongly convinced of a new realism as a perspective. It would have deep consequences for behavioral change also. So maybe, I don't know if you have done research into that or you collaborate on what that could entail. That could be a very promising avenue.
Yeah, so the practical branch, including in a sense the applied branch, instead of application, I prefer to speak of concretion. So I call this concrete ethics. So the concrete part of my philosophy is what I call new enlightenment. And I did develop the idea of new enlightenment, in particular together with Asian philosophers and some indigenous thinkers, mostly from Latin America. So when I say new enlightenment, I don't necessarily in any way refer to the 18th century in Europe. That was just one of the enlightenments, right? When I say new enlightenment, we should also hear enlightenment in the Buddhist sense. So the new enlightenment is the idea, is the practical side of neorealism. And this is based on the idea that the modern scientific Western worldview, in the sense that, you know, we might believe that reality is exactly like the natural sciences exclusively describe it. I think this is just a provincial worldview, which is both, you know, locally provincial and historically short-lived. I think that we are beyond naturalism in that sense, due to the fact that thanks to the global interconnectivity of humans in the 21st century, we now know that others experience reality in other ways. So the next step of new enlightenment is to take this multi-perspectivity, right, this true socio-diversity of humans, and figure out what reality is like by, as it were, integrating on the basis of these differences. So we take the differences seriously, and now we look through the prism of the differences and find what is identical across them. I call this activity universalizing. So universalizing, it's a concept that we find in contemporary African philosophy, but it's also a concept we find in contemporary Chinese and Japanese philosophy, where instead of thinking of the universal as something merely given, we think of it as something that we do together. So through, you know, integration of a multiplicity of fundamentally different views, we find out what reality is actually like. So this does not lead to a relativism where everybody has their own world. It's the idea that we find out how things are by finding out what we share despite our differences. So fundamentally, my term for this, for the method that we're looking for, is enlightened dialectics rather than the dialectics of enlightenment. So the thought is this. So imagine we have two largely opposing views of how to proceed in a given situation. Then we need to look at what they all share, what both share, or, you know, A, B, up to N share. Very simple example. Always start with what I call obvious moral facts. And they are shared across cultures. So for instance, you find versions of the following example in all ethical theories, regardless of where they are from, historically and locally. So imagine, say, a child is drowning in shallow water. And now you face a choice between saving the child, right, or drinking a cold beer. It's a hot summer day. If you save the child, your beer gets lukewarm. What do you have to do, right? What is your moral duty? And everybody will reply, right? Well, I have to save the child. So that's universally shared. And now you take these obvious, evident moral facts, which are kind of often too banal for us to even notice them, and you look for an example that's very close to the bone of contention between A and B, right? And then you look at this example, define shared ground, and then you ask both parties how they would universalize from that basis. And what happens typically in this conversation is that A and B will both be equally ambitious, right, to gain the moral high ground based on what is obvious. And so they will start engaging in a rational discussion based on something they share. If you start with A and B as isolated blocks or as identities, as the saying goes these days, then it is impossible to communicate because you're creating two closed universes, cultures or identities. But there really aren't such cultures and identities. There are illusions that are generated by interests. So A and B might have specific interests, and then they claim that they are fundamentally different. But once you give them the shared ground that lies between the two of them, then you move from blind disagreement, which can lead to conflict and war, to dissent, where dissent just means various perspectives on the same object. So start with something that is shared, that is obviously shared, that's not contentious in any community, and then work your way up. And the goal is to find that which lies in between. So I think the relevant political concept these days is thus, the neutral in the sense of that which is neither this nor that. That's the Latin meaning of neutral. The neutral is not that which is value-free, right? The neutral is that which is neither this nor this.
Is it a form of complexifying morality? Because you have actually different sources and you universalize, you individuate thinking, you build on that practice?
Absolutely. So for instance, whenever you find, deep moral disagreement between groups, right? Smaller scale or large scale groups up to the level of societies, right? So whenever you have this deeper moral disagreement, the interesting question is to ask, what is the actual context in which this makes sense, the actual context, not my representation of it, and what's the actual context in which my belief makes sense. And I call actual context of moral disagreement, in a recent book I'm writing, moral situations. So there are different situations. And the question now is, right, what is the common ground between two situations? And this is the way out of the conundrum that we're in. So actual communication across moral difference presupposes that we create a shared situation. But we can only create a shared situation if both parties try to fully understand the position of the other party. And you don't understand the position of the other party if you give a stereotypical representation of the position of the other party. So if you think of the other party in the terms that you're used to using, then you will just misrepresent the other party because you are already in the conflict situation.
Let's try to translate that to the macro context of our China Knowledge Network and the policy making that we apply, that we put in practice. In our policy note on China, the Dutch government policy note on China that was written some 5 years ago, we make a distinction in our relationship with China. We give it actually 3 states. We can either collaborate, or we can compete, or we are rivaling. And all 3 apply. Depends on what administrative responsibility you have, how you look at the situation, how you look at the relationship. It's very divergent. Opinions are not shared in general. I mean, they have to be conquered in the political realm and in the governance realm, both on the Chinese side and on the, let's call it, European side. Now, one way of trying to put your approach into practice on this macro example would be to ask both parties to sit down, not to prejudge each other, but also to accept that when you have a discussion on morality and in this relationship, that you are yourself part of the challenge, even if you do not believe that, but just as a sort of proposition, because otherwise you cannot sit at the table and have this discussion. That is a very deep, very undiplomatic, I would say, way of going about it. So I'm reasoning from practice. Let's take this as a sort of open question as to what should we do, what could we do in order to organize this sphere, this type of conversation, which is very different from what we normally negotiate if we're talking about competition and which is economic, the trade rules. If we talk about rivalry, which is military, which is monetary, there are many elements to it. You generally do not get to this sort of discussion. But if you are talking collaboration, of course you can. So what could we do to strengthen that collaborative part?
So I think, a very strong starting point is to look at shared conceptions, and there are various offers on the table. So there are debates, for instance, also in contemporary Chinese thought. It's just one layer of many. But for instance, two terms come to my mind. But the landscape is, interestingly differentiated, of course, in China itself. But one discussion of which I have been a part recently is about Gong sheng. Gong sheng means, literally translated, to, become together, right? To change together, right? Gong means together and sheng means to become. And this is the Chinese translation of the Greek term symbiosis, right? So it has its own meaning in the context, right? I translate this into German as zusammenwachsen, growing together, and then we have the term concrete. So when I talk about concrete ethics, I'm also referring to that debate. Another tradition in China, right, comes from, the ancient Chinese thought in all its traditions, be it Taoism, Confucianism, and so forth, right? What all classical traditions share is the idea of the heaven, which is why some contemporary theorists speak of Tianxia, all under one heaven, right? So, and then the idea is that, look, there is something we all share simply in virtue of the fact that we are on this planet. We are planetary beings. And I think the planetary revolution, the shift from thinking globally to thinking in terms of the planet, is common ground between contemporary European thought and contemporary Chinese thought. But they have different histories. And I think what we need to do at this point is to understand, to try to learn something from each other. What can we learn from the Chinese Taoist, Confucian, and so forth traditions, also from the Chinese reception of Western thought, Sino-Marxism and so forth? What is happening right now, intellectually, politically, socially, and culturally in China? And we need to understand that, including a long history of how modernity has entered China, before we can, talk about very specific moral questions. So, the geopolitical disagreement and moral disagreement about cases and differences in business culture, right? Again, on all scales of interaction between Europe and China, we need to see that there's a gigantic historical background to our practices. And where very often when I go to different places in Asia, my Asian friends and interlocutors tell me that they're surprised by how little we currently think about our own historical tradition. And it is certainly not at all enough to think of Europe as, colonizers, right? So that's just one dimension of European modernity. So I think that what we can learn when engaging in particular with China is that we're dealing with social formations that are simply older than ours, right? So I often, when I describe contemporary China, I sometimes say, think of it as ancient Egypt, but not ancient. So imagine Egypt did not have this huge cultural cut, right? Maybe just a short period, right, where Egypt was a little weak. But imagine that the ancient Egypt empire was still around, how would you deal with that? And that's the way to think about China. And I think a version of that, you need to think of China as a gigantic historical system of the highest complexity, right? 1.5 billion people interacting with each other with a gigantic historical background. And now the next step is not to just look at China as something that is very different. We need to now think of us in those terms, right? So what would it take for us Europeans to rethink the fact that we are Europeans? And that means that we also have this gigantic wealth of histories in the plural, not one single shared history, but various histories that are entangled in the contemporary European constellation. And I think that the Chinese are much better at studying us through this prism of hyper-complex history than we are with respect to them. And I think before we can have a meaningful collaborative, engagement with each other, I think we need to learn to understand that this is what we are facing, right? To understand China as a fully independent body of spiritual human self-determination, and not as a variation of something we think we understand. That's the best way to begin to understand China, I believe.
How would you look at the distinction that we can make when you compare Oriental philosophy or thinking, which is not quite the same, in approaching this relationship that you mentioned between we have to look at the other and individuate thinking and complexify morality, but we also have to look at ourselves and the relationship we have at ourselves, which is basically very different in the European tradition or in the Oriental tradition. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so many have argued, and I think at the end of the day quite correctly, that the fundamental difference where, in a certain way, two different paths have been taken a couple of thousands of years ago, right, is on the one hand, the Buddhist and then other Asian Oriental traditions, and the Eleatic, Platonic, Aristotelian path on the other hand. And the fundamental difference is that, Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth asked the question, what is being? So what remains stable in change? And they thought that absolutely everything, including the organization of the political sphere and the economy, should be based on what remains the same over time. That was the fundamental thought, a very powerful thought, which also has led to modern science and the techno-scientific underpinning of our economy. On the other hand, right, the other path taken is the idea that reality at its core, is empty, which kind of also corresponds to another realization in contemporary physics, right? That, the core of the atom is actually almost nothing, but if you split it, you get a gigantic explosion. So there the thought is that, like almost nothing, can generate absolutely everything. The power of emptiness or nothingness, right? So the idea of the empty center, as many contemporary Asian philosophers like to put it.
Is fields of sense also offering an ontology of nothingness, an ontology of becoming?
Yeah, so fields of sense, I would argue, is precisely already a fusion of both. So I started developing the ontology of fields of sense, probably not by coincidence, at a time, about 15 years ago or so, when I was setting up a research center in Heidelberg called Asia and Europe in a Global Context. And we were reading, in particular, the Taoist tradition, the Lao Tzu, with a leading Lao Tzu specialist at the time. But we were also reading Nagarjuna, right, one of the master Buddhist thinkers, together with the Western Neoplatonists. So that was, quite a bit of research that I did. And this is when my ontology emerged. So in a sense, what I'm doing in philosophy has both components. In the ontology of fields of sense, the notion of an object is the locus of truth or facts in a field. But that means that an object is a bundle all facts and not an entity that's independent of the bundle. So I combine both ideas. The idea of becoming, instability, emergence, and the empty center, thus becoming, and the idea of stability, ontology, and being. But my response to the question, what is being? That is my ontology, is in terms of fields. That is, structures that manifest themselves only under complex relational conditions. So I think we can actually, in this case, integrate both already. So my own movement in philosophy has always been that for a long time. My first philosophical law was Schopenhauer, a big idealist, and Schopenhauer was already, as a big romantic thinker, someone who tried to bring together, Vedanta knowledge, Vedic knowledge, of which he can only, he couldn't know a lot at the time, but he was quite interested in the Vedic traditions and how to square them with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And so, like, my own intellectual path for about 3 decades, right, has already been in the wake of, finding a space in between, classical European and classical Asian conceptions.
It would become quite a stretch also, I think, for European practitioners in diplomacy, in government, to take this step to such an ontology and to actually take up a posture that is actually able to accommodate such a conversation with Indian or Chinese or Japanese philosophers or practitioners. Let's try to translate that to some tangible, even if complex and politically difficult subjects that are very much part of the core of our relationship with China, which is not just the binary relationship, it's the complex relationship, meaning we look at the relationship not as China as a classical object, and then all manner of dimensions pass by. So we could, for example, mention how the structure of the monetary system is changing at the moment, which is a deep change, and it's complex. It is a concern for many people, and there's not so much a direct relationship between the United States and the dollar, and China trying to overtake the US and the dollar position. That would be too primitive to say. But there is a structural change in the system, comprised of China collaborating with the BRICS Plus countries and a number of free floaters that try to change the infrastructure for monetary relations. So that would be one arena that is actually emerging, we can say, from a complexity science point of view. And so the question here is not that we can come up with tangible, concrete, direct policy solutions. No, we have to actually get a feel for these structural changes and focus more on how we can collaborate in this arena as it is changing, which is very much about ourselves. It's about our central bank policy. It's about how we create credit. It's about lots of other things. That would be an interesting experiment to try to open up this conversation from the perspective that you have set out, from a new realist approach. Could you think with us how we could shape such a conversation? And maybe we can talk about this subject, but we can also talk about security, or we can talk about technology and the way we try to set rules and we try to influence our position. So this is an open question, and I'm inviting your comments.
So I think it's quite important if we go into our negotiations, right, on all levels at which we're interacting with China, right, where we are already entangled, we need to bring the cultural analysts with us. So take money, right, or the banking system. Money, what does money measure? Money is a kind of measurement system. And so I think money measures value judgments, right? It measures what humans take for valuable. That's what it measures. It's actually a measure for judgments and not for objectively existing goods, right? So much is true in the Marxist tradition, right? One of the reasons why, China could take on board so much Marxist thought is precisely the Marxist distinction between use value and exchange value, right? But what if all value was exchange value, right? So there's just the exchange. Of course, humans use goods and we produce goods for consumption. That's an important level of the economy. But that's not what money is about, right? Money, banks, and in general, capital and investment are about values. So we need to understand the cultural background and the fullest sense of cultural background of our interactions if we want to understand the use of a bank. Right? So while the Bank of China is called the Bank of China and it's a bank, and the Bank of England is called the Bank of England and it's a bank, they are fundamentally different despite the fact that they use numbers that to a certain extent, right, can be traded and translated into each other. To trade is to translate. And so, like, what if we brought specialists for actual translation, including, very importantly, linguistic specialists, right, to understand what it is to think of a bank in China, Yinghang, right? So, we need to look at, the difference. What's the practice? What's behind it, right? What traditions are fused? What kind of risks is China willing to take compared to our risk taking? Because, like our decisions, economic decisions, and diplomatic decisions are always about risk assessment. And what we perceive as risk depends on where we see dangers and opportunities. And that depends on our cultural background. And thus on our deeply cultural conceptions of social and non-social reality. So first and foremost, it would totally make sense to study, contemporary banking practices in China, through the lens of what's culturally specific to them, and then compare that to banking practices in Europe. And this would give us a culturalized model of what we're doing anyhow. And I'm certain that understanding this layer of our practice will make us better at the practice. In general, a possible, tangible function of philosophy, the humanities and social sciences, in all human practices, consists in the philosophical capacity to make the rules of the game explicit. And the more explicit the rules of the game, all of them, right, are, the better our chances of harvesting, the intellectual resources of, as it were, the software of our cultures. And I believe that part of China's successes in, since the 1980s at the latest, part of that success story is that China looked at Western modernity in terms of a culture and not in terms of a monetized rationality, right? This is how they caught up. They studied our culture and not merely our economic practices. And I think a true collaboration would now consist in learning how they do it, not to copy it, but to look back at our own practices, through the eyes of the other. And we can do this on all levels. Every single practice where we are entangled with China will be better understood if we use the cultural lens first for China and then symmetrically for us. The anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro calls this symmetric anthropology. You study, what you perceive as the other in order to understand yourself as the other. We are the other's other. And that's the best way to understand oneself, as the other's other and not as the starting point.
I think that would be very promising, because if you combine that with new realist ontology, it holds a promise. It holds also a promise of things that are actually unthinkable right now. Because if you would have such a cultural substrate of mutual understanding or collaboration and opening up to being not just critically assessed, but communicate at some genuine level, money could also become something that it is not now. And which gives the opening to a new type of monetary structure that is not yet emerging even, but we could shape it. Is that a valid promise that you could share?
So absolutely. So historically speaking, right, many historians of money right, and our economies in general have been pointing out that, the value of money has a spiritual dimension. This is what both the defenders of money and its critics agree upon. So we have just lost touch with this dimension of our economy. We do know that, the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism played some role in the constitution of what we now call capitalism, right? That's kind of common knowledge to a certain extent. But what kind of spiritual practices, forms of life, conceptions of oneself and the other, right, were ingrained in the quantities we were trading? And I think we need to understand this about ourselves right now too. Europe, in a very interesting way, has lost touch with its history, in the sense that we don't understand right now how we stand in history. I'm not arguing that we should continue something that lies in the past. That's not being in touch with one's history. Being in touch with one's history is understanding the genealogy of how we came here, and thus understanding who we actually are as historical agents. We don't start from scratch, never. We start in the middle of the unfolding of a highly complicated story. And what has been happening in particular the last about 200 years with the rise of America was a conception of reality as non-historical. The famous claim by Francis Fukuyama that we have approached the end of history is a particular American conception of history, namely one where there has never been any history, right? And America is now entering history, like it or not, right? It's becoming a historical country. They're making historical choices and so forth. So the way in which we see America in the 21st century is precisely not just like a timeless economic model of pure rationality and competition, right? So that, particularly neoliberal conception of value production has been refuted historically and never really applied in Europe, let alone in China. And I think what we're learning in this century is, that we live in the end of history. History strikes back. And one recommendation for us in Europe, in particular, if we want to communicate with China on eye level, is the full recognition of our own history. So we need to study our historical position. It is quite remarkable and telling about our own blind spots that, as far as I know, in almost the entire West, there's no institute or professorship that really studies the philosophy of history, right? So that's a remarkable blind spot in my own discipline. And whereas, of course, in Chinese universities, they study our histories. And so I think what we need is like an understanding of, who our ancestors were that goes beyond, full recognition of the crimes we committed, right? So currently we only have the conception of the past, of the European past, as blameworthy past, which is an important feature of the various European pasts. But that does nowhere nearly exhaust European history. I'm also not saying that we should look at the great moments of European history. I'm saying that we need to understand ourselves as historical agents that did not start from scratch if we want to gain respect from our Chinese friends.
There is also a clear link between what you described about modernity and perhaps that we lose ourselves in this naive realism, presuming that is what comes before new realism, a sort of techno-scientific approach to life, and think that we can deal with the world and others and ourselves in that way, which is clearly no longer the case. And perhaps the message is coming home.
Exactly. I think the techno-scientific worldview of post-modernity, right, is failing right now. In a sense, we have exhausted the resources of this movement. And these resources come from an interesting, explosion. Two revolutions happen to coincide. The French Revolution, which unleashed much, social energy on the one hand, democratization and generally the bourgeois revolution, right, the end of feudalism in a sense, on the one hand, and the Industrial Revolution on the other hand. And once we had the two of them together as, more or less lucky coincidence, what we saw was the unfolding of the automation of history. So all it took was, techno-scientific progress together with, some social measures. And this led to like a bumpy, very bumpy, form of human progress, summed up in it's the economy stupid. Now, I think this doesn't hold anymore because we have exhausted the resources of it, given that fossil-driven modernity is coming to an end, right? We can't sustain that particular model of modern scientific rationality because it turns out to be suicidal. It's something that we just couldn't know 200 years ago. And as we're approaching that new era, right, other powers are on the rise that were never fully in the grip of that particular type of techno-scientific worldview. And I think this is also an opportunity for us, right, to revise our own worldview and to go back to resources that we also had before, right? Non-modernity, pre-modernity, right, is and the indigenous is as much part of Europe as it is of any other place. So we need to look at those dimensions of the various European traditions, which will also then become a platform for conversations with China. Because if we go back in our traditions 2,000 years ago, right, just to mention the obvious, Roman Empire, say, there has been much more trade and conversation between these two classical places than we currently imagine, right? So we were closer, probably, we were closer to each other in pre-modern times than we have become after the industrialization.
We're now decoupling, we're de-risking, we're diverging, we're politicizing, we're weaponizing. So there's definitely this trend. And I also ask myself if, when I listen to you, how we could engage with China and in a pre-ideological, pre-political sense. Perhaps part of that engagement is also the necessity to engage in a very different way at the European level, intra-European.
Yeah.
Because if we don't do it at the European level, if we don't establish this practice, what chance do we have to speak for any commonality of a European tradition when engaging with China, with the United States, with Africa, with the global South, the global East?
Yeah. So it's very important that, like in a neutral, in both sense of self-consciousness, we Europeans have to become self-conscious. And that requires understanding, right, the nature of fine-grained cultural differences within Europe in order to harvest our own socio-diversity. Instead of thinking that we kind of know what the Europeans are, right, start there with a self-investigation, but do it already in light of the conversation with the others, the perceived and real others. So what can we learn about ourselves from Asia? For instance, when I started going to the United States, and I've talked to many Europeans who had similar experiences when being there from West Coast to East Coast, I kind of learned that I was a European, right? I never felt like a European. The difference between me and an Italian, my own perception before going to the United States, was much bigger. And then suddenly, right, I started having, friends from Spain, and we were together in a new, constellation. And I think that, an interesting question could be, what do we become as Europeans in the conversation with China? We have learned kind of what we become in the conversation with the US. We are becoming Europeans. That's part of our response to Donald Trump right now. We all know that necessarily, right, we need to become Europeans in light of Donald Trump's imperative, right? On all sorts of levels, obviously, including the military. Now, the question, I think, maybe the even more interesting question is, who can we become in the conversation with China? And we are much less ready to answer that question. And in order to begin to address that question, we need to, do this, to literally do our homework. To quote an American philosopher, somewhat against his own intentions, but it's a good quote from Willard von Orman Quine, a great philosopher of translation. He once put it, beautifully and pithily thus: radical translation begins at home.
Is this an opening for a new zeitgeist, or is there enough of a support structure? How can we organize for this? Do you have any propositions that you would like to share? If you put yourself in the position of 12 government agencies, ministries trying to collaborate, going back to the roots of thinking what their knowledge approach is about, what could be baby steps on this pathway?
So I think very concretely, I would begin to invite specialists for various, cultural analyses of China. Including specialists for the various provinces, right? So what is the cultural difference between provinces in China? What does it mean for the Chinese, right? Because it's also a federal system of very high complexity. So how do they manage that? And what are the differences, right? And on all cultural levels, including, which is important for China, the culinary, right? So however poor China was sometimes, right, eating well was always constitutive, right? That played a gigantic role, food. So we need to look at the function of food, of sports, and all of these cultural things, and also linguistic differences, cultural differences, and how they play out. Why are certain things, right? Why are certain industries in Hangzhou, for instance, right, rather than in Beijing? Right? So, and there's a cultural background to this type of decision making. Why is a lot of the AI world in Shenzhen, right? Of course, sometimes it's like a question of resources and harbors, like a purely technological question. Sometimes it's going to have a spiritual, cultural dimension. And I think it would be very important to invite specialists for this, right? Also, like next time you go to China, all negotiations, the better you show that you understand their symbolic language, the social games they are playing, the better they know that you understand the game, the more respect you will gain, and thus it's also a strategic advantage. Because they also expect this from us. They do it about us. They understand how we think, but we don't understand how they think. To put it very, very bluntly, right? I mean, I always ask my students when we discuss this question of cultural difference, in particular with respect to China, here's a simple question. How many people in Europe are capable of following a high-level political discussion in the Chinese news, right? And that's going to be a very small number. And now, how many people in China are capable of following our conversations, right? And that difference is enormous. Right? It's not just that there are more Chinese, right? There are lots of Europeans. It's not just a question of numbers in this case. It's also a question of actual interest. And so, like understanding the other always requires, in a certain sense, falling in love with the other culture, right? So engaging with China means, having a lot of respect as well for the culture. And so again, very concretely, engage in cultural studies of these different practices. Sometimes, even employ people to do this, right? We talked about banking. So what is the practice of banking? How much inflation do Chinese accept, right? I mean, we are very nervous about inflation in Europe for good reasons. What about China? What happens in China when inflation goes up? And there's no universal answer to how humans react to inflation. There are different ways of dealing with inflation. And so if we discuss stability and instability of China, the real estate market, as we saw, China did not break together in a gigantic housing crisis, even though this was reported on our news for years, right? I mean, the story of China will now break down due to the housing crisis, right? It never happened. Why? Because there's a different relationship to housing. And so what we need to understand is this cultural, symbolic, social dimension of contemporary China in order to engage on eye-level conversations. Because again, I can only repeat that. They study us in this way, but we don't study them. And I think this is not just a strategic mistake. I think that the Chinese perceive this as a type of disrespect. Like they are not doing their strategic homework. It's kind of, disrespectful.
Thank you for speaking to the hearts and minds of the China Knowledge Network and Professor Gabriel. Thank you for this conversation. I'm looking forward to re-engaging with you, perhaps at a later stage in Cosmolab. But for now, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.